Hey everyone, Andrea Walford here. Welcome to Make Beautiful Cards. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I created this Just Saying Hello card featuring Stampin' Up's Tasteful Touches stamp set. Now, a couple of techniques that you're going to see me use in creating this card are masking to create depth and dimension in your card, and I'm going to be stamping and embossing my greeting and then showing you how you can fussy cut that out. So let's start by going over the supplies I'm going to be using to create this card. So I'm going to be working on this 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch Daffodil Delight note card. This is a portrait orientation and it's top folding. Now I'm going to be stamping both inside and outside of my card, so I've cut 2 Whisper White cardstock panels, and these panels are 3 7/8 of an inch by 5 1/8 of an inch. I want to mat them onto a basic black cardstock panel, so I've cut these ones to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. So it's cut to just 1/8 of an inch bigger. And what that'll do is when I mat my cardstock onto it, it'll give me a very thin 1/16 of an inch border all around. I also have this little strip of Daffodil Delight cardstock that I cut. It's a little bit smaller than 1/4 of an inch. I think it's about 1/8 of an inch high, and it's 3 7/8 of an inch long. Now the only embellishment I'm going to be using for my card are these Jewels Basic Rhinestones, so just some clear rhinestones in 3 different sizes, small, medium, and large. Now, as I mentioned, the stamp set I'm using is this Tasteful Touches stamp set. I'm going to be using the Just Saying Hello, the flower, and then this little leaves image. Now this is a cling stamp set, so it's made out of rubber mounted onto cling foam, and I've already gone ahead and taken the stamps I'm using and mounted them onto acrylic blocks. So whenever you're choosing acrylic blocks for your stamps, just make sure you choose a size that you have that's as close in size to your stamp size as possible. So the blocks that I'm using are Stampin' Up's D blocks. Now, as I mentioned, the technique that I'm going to be using is masking. And in order to do that, I'm going to need to create a mask out of paper. And I like to use this stamping mask paper from Inkadinkado. Now, if you don't have this, you can always make your own masking paper, and I'll talk about that when we get to that section in the video. The ink colors that I'm going to be using are Daffodil Delight and Mango Melody Classic inks. And then for my greeting, I have this Whisper White pigment ink that I'm going to be using. And then for stamping the outline of my images, I have Memento Tuxedo Black ink. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to be heat embossing. So I have here some of Stampin' Up's white Stampin' Emboss powder. I have a heat tool. And then I have this coffee filter. So I always use this when I'm embossing, and you'll see what I do with that. As you can see here, I also have a black Stampin' Write marker. And the reason I have that is because sometimes when you're masking, the images might not, the edges around the mask might not stamp perfectly well, so I can fill that in with my marker. Now, to add color, I'm going to be using an ink blending technique. Now, my preferred tool for doing this are these makeup blending brushes, and I purchased these on Amazon in a set of 10, and they come in different sizes. So I chose the sizes that were most appropriate to the image that I need to add color to. Now, if you don't have these makeup blending brushes, they're pretty inexpensive, so I'll link to them and you can see which ones I got. But if you don't have them, you can use sponge daubers, or you can use some stamping sponge, which you cut into wedges. The reason I like this better is, as you can see, the surface area is smaller, and I just find it a little bit easier to get a smooth blend. But work with what you have. Now, the adhesive I'm going to be using is this Tombow Mono Multi-Liquid Glue. You see me use this all the time. It's a very great multi-purpose glue that has a very strong bond, and it has some open working time, which means that it gives you a little bit of chance, a little bit of an opportunity to change the position of your pieces if you need to. Now, what I forgot to mention for embossing, I'm also using an embossing powder tool. And that's to remove static, and I'll explain that to you when we get to the embossing section. I always like to keep an adhesive eraser whenever I work with liquid glue, because that way if any glue squishes out around something I stamp or I get it somewhere accidentally, this will take it off with no problem. I'm also going to be using a pair of fine tipped scissors. These are my paper snips. And then I'm going to show you some tools that are helpful to have but optional. So here I have, this is the Herma Dotto repositionable adhesive, and I use that to secure my cardstock to my grid paper when I'm stamping. I like to have a fine tip pair of tweezers. I just find it a lot easier to pick things up, like my rhinestones, my greeting, you'll see me use it for that. And then I like to have some kind of a craft blade. So here, this one is an X-Acto knife with a standard number 11 blade, but for really fine areas, I also like this Fiskars swivel tip blade. So you can see the difference here. It's a very tiny blade size, so it's easier to get into really small areas. The surface I'm working on is my Stampin' Up! Grid paper, and I always work on this. And then beneath that, I have a self-healing craft mat. So now that we've gone through all the supplies, let's get started making our card. So the first thing you need to do for this card is to create a couple of masks. So I'm going to be using this Inkadinkado stamping mask paper. Now I really like this paper because it's a very thin paper that has a low tack adhesive on one side. Now, if you don't have masking paper, then you can create a mask using a very lightweight, thin copy paper and some of your Tombow Mono multi-liquid glue. And I'll talk about how in just a minute. So what you're going to do is you're going to take the paper you're going to be using for a mask, and you're going to take your flower image from the Tasteful Touches stamp set, and you want to stamp it twice in Memento Tuxedo black ink. Then, using your paper snips, you want to fussy cut it out. Now, an important tip when you're fussy cutting for the purpose of creating a mask for your stamps. Because we're going to be layering this on top of a stamped image, you want to make sure that you cut as close to the line and even a little bit on the line as possible. You don't want to leave a big wide border, because remember, when you're using this to cover an image so you can stamp another image on top of it, what happens is that wherever the mask is, the ink's not going to go. The wider the border, the further away the edge of the image will be from the mask. And you'll see what I mean when we actually go ahead and use it. So once you have your masks cut, you're then ready to stamp your panels. And we're going to be stamping both panels at the same time. So we're going to be starting by stamping our Whisper White cardstock pieces, the one for the inside and the one for the outside. So I have my first piece here, and I've adhered it temporarily to my grid paper using my Dotto adhesive. So I just put a little bit of the Dotto on my grid paper, and it just provides a tacky enough surface that it's going to keep my cardstock piece from sliding as I'm stamping. So for the inside of my card, I just want to stamp a single flower and then this leaf image. So I'm going to do that in my, whoops, I just realized I have this in the wrong orientation. So I'm going to start by inking my flower image. And then I'm going to stamp it in the bottom right corner of my Whisper White cardstock panel, like so. Now before I go ahead and put my mask on it, I'm just going to give it a moment to dry, because I'm working on this ultra smooth Whisper White cardstock. I find that some inks, particularly this black ink, can take a little bit longer to dry, and I don't want to smear or smudge the image. So while I give that a second to dry, let's just talk about making your own mask. So if you can, I definitely recommend you buy some masking paper, simply because it's a much thinner than normal paper and it already has an adhesive evenly applied to the back. However, if you can't get your hands on masking paper, you can make your own. So as I mentioned earlier, you just choose a very lightweight copy paper, and then what you're going to do is you're going to take some Tombow Mono liquid glue and you're going to spread it on the back, and then you're going to leave it to dry. Once Tombow Mono glue dries, it becomes repositionable. It's only if you stick pieces together while it's still wet that it becomes permanent. So that's how you would create your own mask. So I'm going to peel off the backing. So this reveals the tacky side. And then what I want to do is I want to carefully place this over my stamped image. So what this is doing, the masking technique allows you to create depth or dimension in your image. So in this case, I want to be able to tuck my leaf image behind my flower. Because if I were to just stamp my leaf and then my flower, you would see where the two images overlapped, you would see them. Like you would see the stem overlapping the flower, even if I stamped the flower on top, and it would just look really bad. So this way, I can stamp this and make it look like it's tucked underneath. So I'm going to ink this up, and I'm going to stamp. Now when I'm stamping, I'm applying a little bit more pressure than normal, especially in the area where it's overlapping the mask. Because here's the thing, to get a nice crisp stamped image, you have to have an even amount of pressure applied between your stamp and your paper, and your stamp has to be on an even surface. Your masking paper basically creates an unevenness in the surface because it's now slightly higher than the rest of your cardstock. So where it's slightly higher, your image may not stamp all the way, and you can see that right over here. So that's perfectly normal for that to happen. But as you can see, if we pull off our mask now, see, this is what it would have looked like if I had stamped just directly on the flower here. I would have seen this on top of the flower, which would have looked really weird. But this way, it looks like the leaves are tucked behind the flower. Now, in order to correct that, that is why I have my black Stampin' Right marker. So this marker has two tips, a brush tip and a fine tip, and I'm going to take the fine tip, and I'm just, with a very loose hand, going to finish off the lines of my image here. So you can see I'm carrying the line directly to the edge of the stamp. So there you can see how that looks. So that is our first panel stamped. So I'm now ready to stamp my second panel, which is actually going to be the front of my card. And in stamping this one, we're actually going to be doing double masking. So that's why we needed two masks. So first off, I'm going to ink my flower. And I'm just going to ink it this way so I can better see that my stamp has been properly inked. And I want to stamp this on a slight angle. So you can see I'm tilting my block. And I'm going to press and stamp. And then I'm just going to give this a second to dry. Actually, the other thing you could do to speed it up is to just give it a quick shot of heat. Now, in order to tell if it's dry, I just take a quick look to make sure that I don't see any shininess from the ink. So now I'm going to take my mask and I'm going to place this on top of the flower, like so. And I'm going to stamp my second flower. Now, whichever flower you want to be at the front is going to be the first flower you stamp. Whichever one you want to appear further behind to create that visual depth is the one that you're going to stamp second. So in this case, because I wanted this bottom flower to be at the front, this is the second flower that I'm stamping. So I want it to slightly overlap my first flower, and then I want it angled in the other direction. Now remember, when you're stamping over a mask, you have to apply a little bit of extra pressure. And then if I peel off this mask, you can see it looks like that flower is tucked behind my first flower. Now I'm going to give this a quick shot of heat again. And this now is where double masking comes in. So I'm going to take my second mask and I'm going to place it on top of this flower. Because now what I want to do is I want to stamp the leaves so that they look like they're tucked behind these flowers. So I'm going to stamp some leaves here, here, and then coming out the back here. So I'm going to go ahead and ink my leaf stamp. And I'm going to stamp this first image. Again, applying a little bit more pressure where I know the stamp is overlapping the mask. Now you can't, this extra pressure, you can't do that with all stamps. Like if a stamp has very fine lines and you apply too much extra pressure, you can end up with mushy stamp lines. But in this case, this is kind of already a very rustic looking image. So when you apply that extra pressure, it doesn't wreck your lines. Okay, so now this one, I want to make sure, of course, you have to make sure when you're doing this, so when you're positioning where your stamp is, that the stem is not going to go off your masking paper. So you have to angle it in such a way, like if I stamped it here, then you would see part of the stem here, which would look really odd. So I'm going to stamp it like this, and then I want some leaves here behind the flower, like that. So now you can see here, let's lift off the top mask first. And I'm lifting it off carefully. I don't want to tear it, because what I like to do with my masks is, as long as my paper remains tacky, I save these by putting them into my stamp case. So here you can see we've now stamped our image, and we have actually quite a good impression. We don't have to do that many corrections. I think I just have a little bit right here. So there you go, that looks really good. So now I'm just going to give this a little bit of a chance to dry, and then I'm going to show you how we're going to add our color using some ink blending. Okay, so for my ink blending, I've got my ink blending tools, which are actually makeup blending brushes that I bought on Amazon. I have my Daffodil Delight and I have my Mango Melody. I'm going to start with the first piece of cardstock that I stamped, because that's had more of an opportunity to dry. So what I'm going to do, this brush looks like it has still some pink residue, so I'm not going to use that one. I'm going to use one that's slightly larger, that's clean. So I'm going to start with my lightest color, and this is my Daffodil Delight. Now when you're using this, you tap your brush against there. Notice how this has a flexible handle. So I like to hold it further back. If you hold it too close, then you're more likely to get the bristle impression or uneven impression. If you hold it further back, basically you're just keeping a very loose hand. Now always tap off, because you can see you end up with a much more concentrated amount of color. And what you want to do when you're sponging is you want to build color softly. So I'll tap off, and then I'll start off my cardstock, and I'll work in a circular motion, and I'll start pulling the color onto my cardstock. Now what I want to do is I want to create a very soft wash of Daffodil Delight. And I want to cover the flower and then the sides, but I want to leave a white area here. Now I'm going to, actually let me just add a little bit more here. Now I'm going to very gently tap in Mango Melody, and I'm going to do the same thing. Now Mango Melody is a much stronger color, so I have to tap off a little bit more, and I have to be more careful when I'm building the color onto my cardstock, because otherwise you can just end up with this big blob of Mango Melody. So when you're working with a darker color, it's much better to build your color up in layers. And this is no matter what tool you're using, like not just you know, using makeup blending brushes. If you choose to use the sponge daubers like I used before, then, or like I mentioned that you could use sponge daubers or stamping sponges, whatever you're using, you always want to build your color up slowly. So there you can see what that looks like. So now I'm going to come to my front panel piece, and I'm going to do the same. So I'm just going to clean off as much of the ink as I can, because I'm going to go back to my lighter color. Actually, probably should have done both panels in the lighter color at the same time, but I didn't. So as with the other piece, I want to keep most of my color here kind of like in a really flat partial U shape, I guess you could say. And as you can see, I really only have to use kind of one tap on my ink pad, and that gives me more than enough ink. See, now I want a little bit more pressure, so I'm bringing my finger a little bit closer, like onto my brush itself. So now I'm going to lightly tap Mango Melody, and I want to brush it close to the edges, and I want to bring some of the color in, but I don't want to completely overlap where the Daffodil Delight was. So I'm trying to be careful that I stay close to the edges. So now what I want to do is I want to add the Mango Melody so that I have a deeper flower center. So I'm taking my smaller brush. And this time I'm not starting off the cardstock, but what I'm doing is I'm starting kind of tapping in the middle to get the deeper concentration of color. And then very lightly, I'm just bringing it up onto the petals a little bit. The reason I like these makeup blending brushes so much is because you have a lot of different sizes, so you have a lot more control. So like with this, I wouldn't be able to get such fine color if I was using the larger blending brush. And the sponge daubers, I find, although they're pretty good with blending, it's a lot harder to get into the smaller areas simply because the surface area is much bigger. Like if you look at this compared to this, look at the difference in size. So there you can see. And let me just do that quickly to this one since I didn't do that before. So now we're ready to move on to the next step. So now I'm going to take here a scrap piece of basic black cardstock, and I'm just going to stick it to that same dotto adhesive so that it stays in place. And we're going to be doing our heat embossing. So for this, whenever I'm heat embossing a white image on a dark color cardstock, I basically like to double up on the white. So what that means is I'll stamp my image in a white pigment ink and then emboss with white embossing powder. Now, if you don't have a white pigment ink, you could use a Versamark ink pad, which is a clear watermark ink, but I find you get a much bolder impression if you use white on white. So that's why I do that. Now, embossing powder is simply made out of a type of plastic that's been colored, and therefore, because it's so fine, it can tend to stick everywhere where you don't want it to stick, and that's why I use my embossing powder tool. So I simply run that over my cardstock piece, and this is like an anti-static bag, so it's going to keep the powder from sticking where I don't want it to stick. Now I'm going to take my stamp, and I'm going to ink it up. So pigment ink, if you've never worked with it, is a slow drying ink. So dye-based inks, the colors we've been using so far, all dry quite quickly. This one, if left to air dry on its own, takes much longer to dry. So I'm going to stamp this in the bottom corner of my cardstock piece, so you can see the white there. Now I'm going to hold this over my coffee filter, and I'm just going to tap off the excess, and you can see it tapped off beautifully. Now, if you find that you still have issues with powder sticking, because sometimes it does, having a very fine tipped paintbrush or a paper piercing tool or the tip of an X-Acto knife can help in getting stray little bits of embossing powder off areas where you don't want them. So now, and this is why I like using my coffee filter, I can just funnel this right back into my container. So now what we need to do is to melt this powder. So for that, I'm going to be using my heat tool. And this heat tool, this is from Stampin' Up. This has two settings, number 1, number 2. Number 2 is the higher setting. And what you want to do is you want to hold your heat tool so that the tip is about 1 inch away from your sentiment. Now, I'm going to be doing this off camera simply because this is very loud. But one thing I will mention is when I'm heat embossing, I like to do it both from the front and from the back, simply because as you're heating your paper, you'll notice that it warps a little bit. And if you heat on both sides, it keeps it even, so it keeps it from warping too much in one direction or another. Okay, so now it's time to fussy cut our image. Now, fussy cutting, especially of an image like this, is not for the faint of heart. It takes time, and it takes a lot of patience, and it takes a relatively steady hand. So first, what I like to do is just, because this is on a fairly big piece of cardstock, just to give me a lot more control, I like to take my scissors and I like to very loosely cut around it. Now you can see I have a few things in front of me. I have my paper snips, I have my swivel knife, and I have my regular X-Acto knife. I also have a little self-healing mat, and this is two-sided, black and blue. When I'm working with dark pieces, I like to work on the blue side. Now you could work on your big self-healing mat, but I actually prefer not to, because as you're using your self-healing mat, it gets all marked up and cut up. And if you're using it to stamp on after that, then it can affect the quality of your stamped images. So I like keeping a little mat to cut with. So the first thing I like to do is to start with the outside of the image. Now I have a separate video on fussy cutting, and I'll make sure that I link to that, or I will have one. It's not up yet, but once it's up, I will link to it. That shares some tips with fussy cutting. But generally what I like to do is I always like to start with the outside of the image. Where the X-Acto knife comes in is when you get to the inside of the image. Now you could, if you wanted to, keep this image together. So you could simply, if you didn't want to cut out each individual piece, you could just cut all around the outline, and then you could stick it on your card like that. But in this case, I did not want that much black showing. So what I basically did was I cut each one apart. But before I did that, I try to get as much as I can first with my paper snips. Because while you can get nice and close with your paper snips on the outside, it gets a little bit more challenging to get close on the inside. So for example, there, or down in between the L. So once I have the outline cut like this, so you see here, you could just maybe clean it up in a few little areas and you could stick that on your card. But you see, and that doesn't look too bad. But it's still more black than I want on my card. So this is now where I'm going to come in and cut, carefully cut, but still not like super close, because you'd have to go in and clean it up after. But you can see here, I'm angling around, but trying to make sure I leave enough space with the other piece. And while I can do this with my scissors, notice that the smaller my piece gets, the harder it is to control it. So that is where the swivel blade comes in. So let me show you how I use my swivel blade. So as you can see, this is a very tiny blade, and it's got this place that you can put your finger. So I stick my finger in it and I hold it the same way I would hold a pencil. And then it has this very tiny blade. Now the reason they call this a swivel knife is notice how much movement there is in the knife. I guess I probably shouldn't cut it like that, right? I could cut myself, but notice that the blade swivels. So that gives you a little bit more control when you're cutting with your knife. So this then allows me to get into areas and follow the curve. So I'm holding my paper well in one hand, and then I'm using my swivel knife to follow along the curve. And you can see that I've started to cut there. Now, when you're cutting in areas, you do need to cut it in pieces at a time. So don't just expect it to follow the curve. So you can see here, I've cut a portion of this, and now I can go in and cut this area. I didn't try to follow it all the way around. It's a lot harder that way. So you just use your knife, and I'm gonna cut the ones that are easy and obvious and close to me first, and then I come back later to clean it up. Now when you're doing this, you do have to apply a decent amount of pressure so that you can make sure you're cutting all the way through the cardstock. So I'm not going to sit here and make you watch me do this whole thing. You've seen how I use my knife for fussy cutting. You could also use a regular X-Acto knife if you don't have a swivel knife. You just want to make sure that you keep the tip kind of raised so you're using less surface area and you have more control over your cuts. But the principle would be the same. The only difference between the two blades is that this one, you don't get as smooth in the curving areas as you do with this one. So I'm gonna go ahead and finish cutting, and then I'll come back and show you what that looks like. So here you can see I finished cutting out my images, and you can see how I really got in close with the T and in the J there. What I didn't do was cut out the inside of the letters. I left that black. One, because that's really fine, but also I actually just kind of like the contrast of that extra black. Now, what if you don't want a fussy cut? Well, you can do what I did earlier, which is less fussy cutting, so you cut around it, or you could simply choose a smaller sentiment and stamp it on here, because as you can see, this just saying hello, it's a little bit too big. The other thing you could do is if you had some kind of a punch or something, you could stamp and punch. The only thing with if you were to stamp and punch or die cut or something like that to create a label is that it hides part of your image, and in this case I want all my image showing. So what I would do if I didn't want a fussy cut, I would just choose a smaller sentiment and I might nestle it right down here. So before I go ahead and stick that down, let's start assembling all our pieces. So first I'm going to put my little cardstock strip along the bottom of this piece. Now I'm going to add a little bit more dado since mine has lost a lot of its tackiness, and I'm going to align my cardstock with the lines on my grid. So this makes it a lot easier to make sure that I'm sticking things down straight. And I'm going to hold this with my tweezers, because it'll help me stick it down afterwards. So I basically want to stick this up about 1/4 of an inch from the bottom. You know, I just realized something. I actually want to have some of the leaf down here. So I might, before we go ahead and stick that down, because I want to have some of that leaf showing, I'm just going to quickly stamp it. Stamp some of the leaves down there. Now, because I'm not having it, I'm only inking most of it, not all of it. But let me just do that quickly. I'm going to place a little bit of glue. Now, when you're working with a really fine piece like this, you have to make sure that you do not put too much glue when you're working with liquid glue, because that's when you run the risk of it squishing out. So as I apply a little bit of glue, I'm just rubbing it a little bit with the tip to flatten it out so I don't have big globs. Now, making sure my piece is perfectly aligned with my grid lines, I want this to be exactly 1/4 inch. My lines there, and then I guess I had cut this a little bit longer. I'm just using my snips to cut that. Now I'm going to take this piece and once again using my glue, I'm going to stick this to my black panel. I'm not as worried about the glue squishing out here, because you can see I leave it far enough away from the edges that even if it squishes a little bit, it's not going to squish out from around the edges. And then I'm going to stick this to my card. Whoops. And then repeat for the inside panel. So now let's go ahead and stick the sentiment to the card. And one of the things I like to use for this is a ruler. I have this T ruler. I think it's a drafting style ruler. And the reason I like it is because I can align it with the edge of my card like this, and I can slide it up and down. So I'm not reliant just on the grid markings here. And I'm going to start, before I stick anything down, I just want to see where I'm going to position this. See, if I were to follow the way the greeting went, you could see the J is just on the other side of the saying. So you can have it much closer like that. But I actually don't like the just so far, sticking out so far. So I think we're just going to move it in, and I'm going to space these a little bit further apart than the stamp. So yeah, so I like it better, a little bit spaced further apart than the stamp. So now I'm going to use my ruler, and I want my hello to be right there. So now I can grab my tweezers, and I'm just touching glue to various glue doesn't want to come out. Various areas of my hello, and I'm spreading it out with the tip. Because again, I don't want it to squish. Sometimes if I have too much glue, what I'll actually do is I'll just touch it off to the side onto my grid paper just to get rid of a little bit of the excess glue. So now with my tweezers and using my ruler to align my sentiment, I'm going to stick it down. So I'm going to just go ahead and do this for all my pieces. And then once I'm done that, I'll be back. So there you can see what that looks like. So my last step now is to add a few rhinestones. So I'm just going to carefully pick them off with my tweezers. I'm going to put a large rhinestone there. See, these are self-adhesive rhinestones, and I never press them in place until after I've finished positioning my rhinestones, just in case I want to play with the positioning. And then once I've stuck down my rhinestones, I simply press them down just to make sure they stay in place. So there you have it, we're done our card. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video tutorial and that you learned a lot of useful tips and tricks to help you in your card making. And I look forward to creating with you again. See ya!